Okay. Hi, everyone. Just pulling up our full list of panelists. Let's grab Krista. We can't start without Krista. Okay, great. Awesome. Okay, hi, everyone. Lovely to have you here. I'm Emily Ringer with Polar Bears International, and welcome to Conservation Happy Hour. Today we're going to be talking about a really important piece in the polar bear conservation puzzle, policy. So specifically policy challenges that are impacting polar bears today. And we are joined by Kassie Siegel, Senior Counsel and Climate Law Institute Director for the Center for Biological Diversity, and then our very own Geoff York, who is a staff scientist and Senior Director of Conservation. But before we jump in and get started with these two, a couple of Zoom housekeeping items, just to make sure that we're all on the same page and know how to use the tools in this platform. So this is a little different than a Zoom meeting. This is a Zoom webinar. So you'll only see the videos or hear audio from the panelists. However, there are ways that you can engage to make sure that you get your questions answered and to interact with these panelists. So there's the chat feature, which I see already has 20 messages in it, so is probably well understood, but please feel free to let us know where you're tuning in from, and just to any kind of casual chatter can live there. And then if you have a formal question, I ask that you submit that via the Q&A feature. So you'll see on the bottom toolbar of your Zoom webinar window, there will be a series of icons, and there's a Q&A icon, little overlapping chat boxes. And you can submit your question there, and I will do my best to pepper them in throughout the presentations, but anything we don't get to during the presentation, we'll make sure to come back to and revisit at the end. So everyone will get their questions answered. That's really the broader purpose of this, is to connect you with experts in the environmental and the polar bear conservation world, and to get your questions answered. So with that, we will move on, and I'm going to pass the floor to our Executive Director, Krista Wright, to kick us off. Oh, and we have you muted, Krista. It wouldn't be Zoom if someone didn't.
There we go. I'm a little discombobulated. I was frantically looking for the link. I just got back from vacation, so that's my excuse. But it's good to see virtually so many familiar faces and some new faces. Thanks for joining us. This is a very special occasion, because we have our dear friend Kassie joining us. And Kassie is one of my heroes, actually. I consider her one of my conservation heroes. Besides her amazing work that she does with the Center for Biological Diversity, she is just a champion for the bears, a lifelong champion for the bears. She led the listing and won to list polar bears on the Endangered Species Act. And so we will forever be, she'll be our hero, and thankful for that. But most importantly, both Kassie and Brendan have spent a lot of time with us on the tundra, helping support all of our initiatives, whether they're doing webcasts from the tundra through our Tundra Connections program, but also as advisors and just guiding us throughout the last decade. And I think as we take on more of this policy and advocacy work, we'll be leaning on them probably more than we ever have, as it's a new part of our work. And we're all very lucky to have her here today, because she's going to impart on us some very good, useful information, I know. And she's just a wealth of knowledge. And I think we'll all walk away feeling empowered that we can take an action on behalf of polar bears, and that specifically is addressing greenhouse gas emissions and climate action. So with that, thank you, Kassie. It's great to see you. Hopefully I'll see you on the tundra next time with the bears, but I appreciate the time that you're giving to us and to our constituents today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Krista. Emily, Jeff, Janet, and everybody. It is 100% my pleasure and privilege to get to have this visit with the PBI family. Thank you so much.
Yes, well then we're going to start with you, Kassie. We're going to start in the climate sphere because sea ice loss due to climate change is the largest threat to polar bears, and policy changes are needed to reduce the carbon emissions that are causing the planet to warm and that sea ice to melt. And so I want to echo everything that Krista just said. We're super grateful to have you here with us, Kassie. And I remember my first time meeting you. I think it was my very first season with Polar Bears International. I was an intern doing field work maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And you really were so inspiring to me then and clearly continue to be. So we're just very grateful to have you here. And I'm hoping you could start us out today by just telling us a little bit of your background and your relationship to Polar Bears International and your work on behalf of polar bears.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Emily. So I knew my whole life that I wanted to be in nature as much as possible. I wanted to do as much as possible to protect nature. And I ended up going to law school to do that. And in a kind of unusual move, I ended up starting working for the environmental group I work for now, my first semester in law school. I've never left and I've never worked anywhere else. And it was actually back in the 1990s when I was still in law school. My life partner and professional colleague, Brennan Cummings, who Krista mentioned there, he had the idea that we really need to do an Endangered Species Act petition for a species that was threatened primarily by climate change to raise awareness of climate change. And so at that time, we started monitoring the scientific literature, looking for a species we could do that for. And in the summer of 2004, the science was first published. There was a paper by some of the world's leading polar bear scientists working in Canada, I think all of whom are affiliated with PBI. And there was the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment that came out that year. And so with that science, we were able to put together the legal petition to get protection for polar bears, to file that before the US government, and to start a 3+ year long campaign and series of lawsuits actually to get the bear protected. And while that was going on, Robert Buchanan cold called us and was just so wonderful. PBI has always been so supportive. Unfortunately, sometimes there's a lot of competition in between environmental groups, like any other field, I suppose. But from the very beginning, Robert and everybody at Polar Bears International has always been so incredible and so supportive. They brought me up there to Churchill for the first time in 2007, and I had the great privilege to go up there a number of times since to see the bears, to do some webcasting, to meet so many amazing scientists and advocates. It's been an incredible thing for my career, so helpful to actually get to see the bears and learn from everybody up there and doing the conservation work, and always such great collaboration with PBI. So thank you again for having me back.
Yes, well, we're grateful that we're able to connect with you via Zoom until we can hopefully one day see you in person again. Can you tell us, Kassie, a little bit about what your work looks like now, what you've mainly been dealing with over the last couple of years?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to say that preserving the habitat for the bears and reducing other threats other than climate, that is super important work. And I know PBI does a lot of that. Others at my organization do a lot of that. I have done it, but over the years, I've really gravitated towards a laser focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because we can't save the bears if we don't do that. And 85% of US greenhouse gas emissions come from fossil fuels. And climate policy can be really complicated, but it doesn't actually need to be so complicated, because we have to limit fossil fuel production to no more oil, gas, and coal, then we can burn and still stay below our temperature targets. And many of you are probably familiar with the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees and the severe damage that comes with even small amounts of warming above 1.5 degrees. And of course, you know, polar bears are a climate sentinel species. They are threatened particularly early and intensely, of course. And so limiting fossil fuel production has long been the missing piece of climate policy, but it's the most fundamental. And oil and gas companies alone, even if we assume that all coal extraction started tomorrow, oil and gas companies alone plan enough extraction to blow us way past 1.5 degrees if that was all produced and burned. And so I today spend most of my time actually fighting oil and gas development and working for limits on production. And we actually had a big victory here in California on Friday, where I am. We've been working for this for over a decade, some new policies in California, and Governor Gavin Newsom on Friday announced he was going to ban fracking by no later than 2024 and phase out all oil and gas production by no later than 2045. And that's actually quite a big deal. It's a big victory. It's also actually not fast enough, but that's the kind of thing I work on a lot.
Well, we are very grateful for that work on behalf of polar bears and on behalf of really all of us, seeing as this issue will touch everyone and everything on the planet. So thank you, Kassie. Thinking kind of globally, so we know that global climate action, as you said, is necessary to conserve polar bears and ensure this stable planet for all of us. And nearly 200 countries are negotiating a plan to address the climate crisis through the Paris Agreement. And I was hoping you could speak a little about what the status of that agreement is right now and what that means and just the state of global climate action in general.
Yes, so President Biden rejoined the Paris Climate Accord as a day one action. And that was great, but it's also far from sufficient. But he's done more. Last week, he actually announced the United States reduction pledge for the international talks. And that is a 50% reduction below 2005 emission levels by 2030. It's a big step forward. It's actually twice what the Obama administration had put on the table. And yet that also is actually still not good enough. So in that big IPCC report, they say we need a global reduction of about 50% by 2030. The US is the world's largest cumulative emitter. We are the world's richest nation. It's only fair that we should do more than the global average reductions. And we in fact agreed to this in the original 1990 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The H.W. Bush administration signed that, the Senate ratified it. And unfortunately, our country has yet to honor that commitment. And so many organizations, including mine, are pushing for the US to do better, to get a 70% reduction in emissions by 2030, and also to do a lot more technology transfer and a lot more funding of clean energy in the developing world so that we can really do our part. The negotiations to the successor to the Paris Agreement are starting now. So we have one of these agreements through the process every 5 to 6 years. You will have heard of the Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Accord, the Paris Climate Agreement, and so on. And for years, we have said the International Climate Treaty needs to be fair, ambitious, and binding. And that's still what it needs to be. And the Paris Agreement has some really good things in there, like the commitment to do our best to stay below 1.5, but there's nothing binding about Paris. It's all voluntary. And so we need to actually get more of all of those three things. It needs to be more ambitious, it needs to be binding, and it needs to be more fair. It's been a big struggle over the years, but of course it's really, really important.
Yes. And from a US perspective, we have constituents from all over the world. We do have a lot of people living in the US. And you mentioned Biden's emission reduction pledge of 50%. by 2030, or 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. And I'm hoping you can put that into context for us a little bit. What would that look like? What might that mean? I think it can be a little bit intangible sometimes when we're talking about these really big scale changes, systematic changes.
I think it's going to look really, really beautiful. And that's the thing I love most about my job, is that the things that we're working for are the things that are going to make the world healthier, safer, and better for all of us. If we do them right, it's going to make the world a much more equitable place too. And we have the technology to make these emissions reductions. That's a really, really important point. And a full deployment of clean, renewable energy can be the biggest jobs plan and economic stimulus since mobilizing for World War II. Solar power and wind can be done in a very wildlife-friendly way, mostly on rooftops, wherever possible for solar, well-sited turbines. This will give us so many benefits. For transportation, which is now the largest source of US emissions, the technology is here. We can take the auto fleet, cars and trucks, we can get them to go to zero emissions fast. Electric vehicles are so much better in so many ways, and many are already cheaper to own and operate, and soon all of them are going to be cheaper than the petroleum vehicles. The transition can happen at the speed that government policy says it should happen. And even for other sectors like aviation, solutions are a lot closer than many people realize. Even in the total absence of any regulation for aviation, there are actually many, many emissions reductions available. Short-haul commuter flights are actually already starting to go electric. And we can do Clean Air Act rules for airplanes, just like have gotten us so much air pollution benefits from automobiles. That, as I said, fossil fuel production limits are critical. It makes no sense not to have any limits on production. It's like saying we're going to ban asbestos use in buildings, but we're not going to ban its production. Of course, you address both sides of that when you're trying to get rid of a dangerous thing. And then, the deeper emissions reductions get harder. We need to change land use and transportation patterns. We need to have better carbon-free public transportation that works for people. We need to retrofit the existing building stock. And those are big challenges, but they're also things that are going to be great job creators and great economic stimulus. That's a big question, Emily, but I'll leave it there.
Well, that was a big and beautiful answer. I'm receiving some great questions in the Q&A, so I might pepper a few in here. Taya asks, what are the main problems in reducing fossil fuel usage?
The main problem. So I guess I'm not sure. I'm actually not entirely sure if that means what's the main barriers to do it or what's the main technological problems. But so follow up in the chat or however possible if I'm misinterpreting your question. But I will say, I'll take that as a barriers question. And what I did not appreciate early in my career, like the polar bear petition was about raising awareness. And I really thought, if we raise awareness about the urgency of this issue, clearly policy will change. Because I mean, why wouldn't it? I mean, it's like the fate of all life on Earth as we know it is at stake here unless we do these things. You can't negotiate with the physics and chemistry of the atmosphere, as Bill McKibben already says. However, that hasn't been the case. And the number one reason it hasn't been the case is because certain fossil fuel polluters have been willing to stop at nothing to block the policy. They've actually done a big disinformation campaign on climate. And to this day, they are relentlessly blocking climate solutions and the alternatives to their products at every level in the political system. And so that's what slowed it down. And that's what is the biggest barrier and problem, not technology. And of course, not all the benefits that come from clean energy.
Mm-hmm. And Taya also asks, the alternatives to fossil fuel dangerous?
I'm sorry, are the alternatives also dangerous?
Yeah, are the alternatives to fossil fuels dangerous?
So some alternatives could be dangerous, yes. I'd say nuclear energy, for example, is very dangerous in many ways. Solar and wind and clean renewable energy, some types of geothermal. And when talking about solar and wind, like properly siting it makes a huge difference and brings more benefits, right? So there's less harm and more benefits when you use existing rooftops for your solar panels than there is when you do big, large scale industrial solar projects. We probably need, some of both right now, but we really want to focus on the wildlife friendly stuff that also brings it's called distributed energy when you have rooftop solar instead, and you get grid reliability benefits. And you can also have a lot of benefits to consumers too when you make some structural changes in the utility system.
That's helpful. That's very helpful. I have a question from Don Moore, who I believe you know. Don wants to know if you can speak to the difference between methane and CO2 as a greenhouse gas and how that impacts how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Hello, Dr. Moore. Thank you. I would love to do that. Yeah, and so there are actually quite a few different greenhouse pollutants. Carbon dioxide is in many ways the most important. It is the most plentiful, and it stays in the atmosphere for a very, very long time, effectively forever. So there is no way that any climate policy can succeed without deep and sustained carbon dioxide emissions. Methane, however, is a type of super pollutant. It is much more powerful at warming the atmosphere than carbon dioxide in the short term, though there's not as much of it overall, and it only stays in the atmosphere for about 11 years. So it's much more short-lived than carbon dioxide. And this is actually why I started working on oil and gas initially, because while the polar bear listing process was going on, we said, well, we need to look at what we actually need to do to save them. And at that time, we put out a report in 2007, and at that time, it was already very clear we need to stop oil and gas leasing, and we need to cut methane emissions down to as close to zero as possible, as quickly as possible, because by doing that, you buy a little time for your other policy changes, and you really mitigate the warming in the short term. Methane is also particularly terrible for the Arctic because methane reduces background ozone concentrations, and ozone in the springtime in the Arctic is very powerful at warming, and it really accelerates that springtime ice melt, which is so terrible for the bears. And so we need immediate methane reductions. The oil and gas sector is number one. They come, of course, from many other places, and it's just absolutely critical that we get on that.
Yes, thank you, Kassie. I do have, let's see, 2 more questions here. And one of them is a question I was going to ask, so that's perfect. So first, our question is there a point in replacing fossil fuels with atomic or nuclear energy? Is there any point in doing so? Sorry, I misspoke.
Yeah, in my opinion, no, we should not be replacing fossil fuels with nuclear. We should be replacing them with clean, renewable energy right now. It's actually much, much cheaper. It's actually much, much safer.
Great. Okay, and then Ralph and I have very similar questions. So one of our most frequently asked questions is, what can I do? How can I help polar bears? And from a climate policy perspective, I wonder, what should we all be asking of our elected officials? What actions are most important in terms of protecting polar bears and the environment at large?
Yeah. And so we need action at many different levels. I'm particularly focused on federal action right now in the United States. We have played 4 years of nothing but defense on the federal level. And so we have a huge amount of catching up to do. It's essential. President Biden is off to a good start. He needs to use his powers under existing law to get going on these emissions cuts we need. And it's been really, really little understood how much the president can do with his executive branch agency under existing law. And it's so essential. So often, climate policy conversations are only about Congress and what new legislation we could have. And I think this is actually not an accident, because for years and years, really well-resourced polluters have pushed this narrative. Whenever a solution is proposed, they say, no, 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 that's not the right approach. We need to do something else, and it needs to be something new that would be needed from Congress, maybe cap and trade, maybe a carbon tax, whatever new policy. And it's like a diverting tactic. But we actually have the strongest domestic environmental laws in the world. And President Biden is finally using them. So we need to support all that action. And many environmental groups will send out action alerts at key moments for input. One of the most wonderful things he did in the first 10 days was put a moratorium on all fossil fuel leasing. And there's going to be a big process going on about that. 25% of US greenhouse gas emissions come from publicly owned oil, gas, and coal. It's held in trust for the American people, but has historically been sold off for development. That's the number one thing. We need to do that. Stop digging that hole deeper. Congress, of course, I mean, can have a role to play, can support the spending, number one, to support all this. And yes, new laws could be helpful, but my number one plea to you, if you're working on supporting a bill, please don't support legislation that rolls back existing laws in exchange for something new. Right now, the oil industry is leading a big push to get a very modest carbon tax in exchange for rolling back Clean Air Act protections. They have cleaned the air we breathe successfully for half a century. They have a critical role to play in cutting greenhouse emissions, and we cannot lose that. We're in a climate emergency. We need to be using every tool in the box. We can't be tying any hands behind our back. And also, strong action at the state level and at the local level. It's also really, really important. And I think it can be more rewarding sometimes to get involved at the local level, where it feels like it's easier to have a large direct impact. So we definitely need it all.
Thanks, Kassie. That's, definitely it's the biggest question out there. And that's a super helpful explanation, because there are so many dimensions at play, obviously, in polar bear conservation and environmental conservation. And it's an important reminder that speaking up is fuel for change. And it's, not just on the global or national level, but also at those local levels, we can have a tremendous impact. So great. Well, that is all the questions I have right now. I'm quite sure that we'll have more for you at the end of this conversation. But thank you so much it's such a treat for me to get these questions answered, and I hope they've been helpful to everybody else. And now we're going to pivot a little bit and change gears to talk about a different conservation or policy challenge that polar bears face. So we'll be turning towards Geoff York. Can we pull you up? Okay, here he is. Geoff York, our Senior Director of Conservation. So let me stop sharing this for a minute. So as we know, while we're addressing this overarching issue of climate change and sea ice loss for polar bears, policy solutions are also needed to protect existing populations of polar bears. And that includes critical habitat and denning habitat for polar bear mothers and their cubs. So Geoff is going to talk to us a little bit today about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's been hot in the news, so I think it will be really enlightening and useful to get an update from Geoff on this issue. So Geoff, I will turn it over to you.
Sure, thanks, Emily.
Yeah.
So at Polar Bears International, we're taking a multi-pronged approach to this, as we do with most issues. We're working with partners to address the climate crisis and working ourselves to do what we can on that, but we're not forgetting traditional conservation. We need to make sure we have stable, healthy populations of polar bears today going into this uncertain future. And so there's lots of work to do on that front. And one of those key things is still protecting key habitat for polar bears. What are the areas they need? What's most important to them? And the one thing that is arguably the most important is safe, undisturbed denning habitat, places that moms can go and quietly dig their dens, have their cubs, and bring them into this world so they can be strong and healthy when they go out to sea for the very first time. When we look at Alaska, one of the most important places this occurs is in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And most of you on this call probably know where that is. Some of you probably been there, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, it's in the northeast corner of Alaska along the border of Canada. It's the largest refuge in the United States at about 20 million acres and goes from the Arctic coast all the way down through the Brooks Range. So it is a massive and diverse piece of real estate. It's not any one thing, and it's home to a diversity of species, including our favorite polar bear and the southern Beaufort nursery. Really is a good way to think of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I've been lucky to work there, on the refuge, around the refuge, and over the refuge for over a decade, doing work in Alaska there. So just quickly, the southern Beaufort Sea polar bear population that dens frequently in this area is one of the best monitored populations in the world still. We have struggled in recent years due to changes in climate, due to changes in sea ice, to successfully continue that long-term data set. And that's largely due to our fall season disappearing because we don't have enough ice to work on, and our spring season becoming less and less reliable due to melting ice melting too quickly, too much water, making it just too dangerous to do capture work that is so critical to much of the work we do. How's this population doing? As you can see on the map here, it's listed in red. Over the last 30 years, it's declined by nearly 40%. So well down, and the trajectory is, as we continue to lose sea ice, we expect this subpopulation to experience some of the brunt of those impacts, and that will be, increasing cub loss, decreasing adult survival, and decreasing population over time, unless we're successful in turning this around and stabilizing that sea ice there. So the importance of the Arctic refuge to this population is to provide new bears. It is that nursery effect, much like Wrangel Island is famous for in the Chukchi Sea population, much like Svalbard is for the Barents Sea population. The Arctic refuge is for the southern Beaufort population shared with Canada there. They also use it for summer resting. So as we're seeing more and more sea ice loss in the southern Beaufort Sea in particular, more bears are spending more time on shore. And a lot of those bears are focusing on the coast of the Arctic refuge, in part because there is an Inupiat community there called Kaktovik that still does traditionally take bowhead whales for food. And those large whale harvests do leave behind some actually natural food for polar bears, and they've fully taken advantage of that over the years. And so that's become a congregation area in the summertime, as well as being an important denning area for polar bears. We've done a lot of work on the refuge, and this last year in particular, we were really excited to produce 2 new papers focused on that. And this is using data we had in hand for both cases. One was led by a graduate student and partners at Brigham Young University, and looked at den disturbance and what we know about den disturbance, and basically looked at over 16 years of our den monitoring data and realized within that we actually had something to say about what was going on there. The other paper looked at forward-looking infrared and den detection. This was a tool that Steve Amstrup and I helped develop almost 20 years ago, over 20 years ago now, when we both worked for the US Geological Survey. At the time, it was the best tool available, and it was very promising. We went back and looked to see, was it as promising as we thought? And the answer was, unfortunately, no. FLIR was missing up to half of the dens in some circumstances. And a lot of that was driven by poor weather. And poor weather has actually been increasing due to climate change, less stable weather. And FLIR is very susceptible to changes in the weather, to blowing snow, active snow, basically a lot of what we think of when we think of classic Arctic weather, especially in the winter there. So both of these papers were critical. They weren't planned this way, but came out at the exact time the former administration was rushing to open the Arctic Refuge for oil and gas development. And so this ties into the question of how does science inform policy? Well, good science, in this case, luckily timed, came out at the right time to provide management agencies and others with the information and tools they needed to slow down that rushed leasing process and possibly stop it in this case, which again wasn't our intent in publishing the papers, but the information contained within them was very useful due to some of the things proposed within the lease sales themselves. And so that was great. We felt very happy to play that role and be a part. We've also taken on more of a role just in the last year and a half to 2 years in working with legal conservation partners in particular to be their scientific experts. So Polar Bears International is not getting involved in legal actions against the government or agencies, but we are providing our scientific expertise to organizations that are working on lawsuits in protection of polar bear habitat and polar bears directly. That ranges from comments on litigation, that ranges from congressional testimony, both written and oral. And that's something that our team expects to stay involved with, for the foreseeable future there. And I think that's us. I have to hand it back over to Emily.
You can hand it back to me. That's great, Geoff. Thank you so much for that context. And I thought I would just jump in kind of at the tail end here to talk a little bit about the current state of the refuge. And so as Geoff kind of alluded to, this area has been highly debated over and contentious for quite some time, for decades. And if we look here, so it's the coastal plain, the $1.5 million acre or million acre coastal plain is the unprotected part of the refuge that when the rest of the refuge was deemed protected, this was kind of left open and in legislative limbo to really be figured out by future Congress sessions to determine whether or not it would be open for oil and gas development or permanent wilderness. And since 1986, this region, I think, or a bill trying to protect this region has entered every single session of Congress. So it has certainly been on quite the cycle. And it wasn't until 2017 that the coastal plain was opened to oil and gas development. And that was part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in December 2017. Now, the first lease sale that authorized 2 lease sales, and the first of those 2 lease sales did happen in 2021, the very beginning of 2021. It was largely a failure. It didn't really attract much industry interest, and no major oil companies ended up placing any bids. And it raised, I think, 1% of what they had projected that it would raise for the federal treasury. So there is an act matching bills in the Senate and in the House right now, the Arctic Refuge Protection Act, that is calling for permanent protections of this space. And Kassie mentioned some of the executive orders that came out on Biden's first day of presidency. He did place a temporary moratorium on oil and gas activity in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So that's kind of brings us to where we are today. Not really, the hope of the Arctic Refuge Protection Act is that it would at least allow for that second lease sale not to happen, and perhaps get some permanent protections for this space. And which kind of leads me to the final announcement of this presentation, which is just that we are officially, we've started, as Geoff mentioned on this piece, their scientific expertise really, I think, was a big reason that we've been able to hold off at least on some of the development of this land, because one of the executive orders cited that inadequacy of required environmental review was one of the reasons that this was paused. And so, we're going to hopefully continue to deepen and develop our work in policy and advocacy, and we're sort of officially launching that this year. So if this work is something that interests you and you want to learn more about it, you will certainly have opportunities over the coming months and years to learn more about it with us. So I will be moving more into this work at PBI, and then working with a lot of PBI staff and partners and conservation partners. And we're really excited to develop in this space, and looking forward to embarking on this work with you. And if anyone has any questions about the refuge and Geoff's work on that, or any further questions for Kassie, we're happy to take them at this time. I don't see any, but I'm going to give everyone a minute.
Hey, Emily.
Yeah.
Hey, Emily, too. I'm having some feedback here. Okay. Maybe we could also introduce Don as being an important part of that work, since he's on our webinar.
I would love to. I wish we could turn his video on.
And maybe we're throwing him under the bus. Maybe he's checked out and is, drinking a martini, but
happy hour. Well, John, if you want to, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Oh, yeah. What, do you mind? Okay, I'm going to ask, because we will introduce you, John, but would love to also hear from you. So
yeah. And maybe I can fill in some space. I'm good at that. We have long wanted to take on this kind of work, but we just haven't had the bandwidth, staff capacity wise, and PBI is growing, which is great. And so we are able to take this on, and we're getting started. We've always leaned on people like Kassie and Brendan, and I know we can continue to lean on them to help guide us. And we have other great partners. And in part of being able to take this on is leaning on other outside expertise. And Don Moore is one of those people. He's recently retired, and we are contracting him out to work directly with Emily. So if Don can say a few things now, that would be great. Don, can you?
Sure,
Okay.
I'd be happy to, thanks.
Uh-huh.
So hi, everybody. I'm Don Moore, and I've been working with polar bears in zoos for, I guess, over 20 years. And so I'm working pretty hard with Emily and Krista and the team on reaching out to Congress, because AZA accredited zoos and aquariums have hundreds of thousands, millions of members who care about this kind of thing, and can, contact their own Congress people around the United States, and we can reach, pre-COVID, we were reaching over 200 million people a year who visited directly. But now I think we've broadened our reach, because COVID forced everybody to go virtual. So it's been very interesting. You can actually watch polar bear Nora back at Oregon Zoo. They do a social media post about, at least once a week. And so by reaching out to all of those people who really, really care about polar bears and other life on the planet, we can leverage all of those voices to reach Congress for a good result for not only polar bears and ANWR, but also climate change and action on climate change.
Thanks for that, Don.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you,
we're
Dawn.
lucky to have Don because he has so many years of experience working within the professional zoo community and really helping us, leverage our relationships with the directors. And, zoos have a lot of power, not just in their, because they see a lot of people, but also in their governments too, whether it's their local government or their state government. I mean, they are trusted resources as it relates to science and information on climate change. And so we're really looking forward to Don helping us further this work and grow the work.
Well, and do you mind if I say something about that for all of the viewers here? It's really important that everybody understands that those local politicians and those local staffs or congressional staff kind of are young people often at the beginning of their careers, and they grow up to be Congress, to be our elected representatives, to be our senators, to be our president. And so it's really important that even if somebody puts you in touch with, the lowest level of staff, when you contact the office, treat them with respect and that they have knowledge. They're working really, really hard every day on your behalf because you're constituents, and they will listen. They won't listen if you just, take a post and repeat the post and forward it on to them so much. But they'll listen if you contact them directly. So so please do that and keep watching PBI and our social media action and see if you can help. That would be great. Thanks.
I just want to add real quick too, Emily, that part of what we're going to do with Don is not just work with Congress, but work with agencies directly. Don's located right outside Washington, D.C. And while we have great relationships with staff in the field, staff in Alaska, in our case, with Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS, what we haven't done is taken a proactive role in talking to their bosses and their directors. So we're hoping to, sit down with the director of US Fish and Wildlife Service, sit down with the director of USGS, have meetings with folks like the Marine Mammal Commission and let them know what our concerns are directly. And with Don located there and with our director of communications, Barbara Nielsen, located there, we have the start of a great team with Emily's support to make that happen.
Yeah, and we have a few more questions that we have time for, so I might quickly slot them in. I have one for you, Kassie. Do you believe that worldwide work on the environment is predominantly a legal exercise or a legal challenge?
That is a great question. So I would say, even in the United States, even though I love being a lawyer, I don't see it as only a legal exercise or even primarily a legal exercise by any stretch. What we try to do in our program is put together legal strategies with the science, with organizing and campaigning and education. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to make social change. We're trying to change the world. And of course, we can't do that with any one lawsuit. And when you talk about the whole world, I think it's even more that way. I mean, I'm a U.S. environmental lawyer, but I work with colleagues who do international law work, and I'd say it's even more complicated. So I think international environmental law definitely has a role to play, but really it's about changing the world in lots of different ways, including culture change. Thank you for that.
Yeah, agreed. That was an excellent question. And I have a question for you, Geoff, from Nigel. Is all this research and work being done just in the US, or is it also done on the Canadian side?
It's done around the Arctic. So specific to Southern Beaufort, it's definitely shared population and a shared workload. So on the Canadian side, Environment Climate Change Canada has led most of the work on the Canadian Beaufort, along with scientists from the University of Alberta, particularly Andrew DeRocher's lab there. So we share data, we collaborate routinely with them, and that also includes the government of Nunavut in Canada, who again, is a big player in that Southern Beaufort and Northern Beaufort population area.
Great, thanks. And then the final question is from Ralph, wondering if there's any opportunities to volunteer with PBI on the East Coast. And Ralph, I'll have to get back to you, but it's great to know that you're willing and ready, because we might be able to put you to work. So we'll have Janet follow up. And with that, I don't see any other questions. So I think we will start to draw to a close. I just want to thank Kassie and Geoff so much for your leadership and for sharing your expertise. Thank you, Dawn, for being so willing to be put on the spot and joining in on this conversation. We're lucky to have you on our team. And thank you to all of the supporters. Thank you so much for your interest in this topic and for your ongoing commitment to polar bears and conserving their sea ice home. We really couldn't do this work without you. Every single time we do one of these events, it just further emphasizes for me what a collaborative lift this is. And it's very inspiring to be a part of this team, and our supporters are equal members in that. So thank you all so much. We will have one more conservation happy hour in this series. It'll be 2 weeks from today. I believe that's May 12th. And you will receive an invite to that the week before. And we hope you're able to join us. If not, we are recording these sessions, so you can always watch later if that is your preference. And until then, be well, and thank you again for your support, and we'll see you soon. Bye all. Thank you, Kassie.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Kassie. It was good seeing you.
Everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye.